Hi, my name is EJ Massa. I was browsing eBay, and I saw this Sony PVM that was relatively untested. It's the Sony PVM 20M4U. It's a 20-inch monitor, and from the pictures, it seemed like it turned on, but since the seller had little knowledge of the device, it was hard to assess the condition. I could see the badge was missing. The seller said it turned on, but that's about it. It was listed for $900, but I offered the seller $700, and the seller accepted. In working condition, these can be sold for $1,500 to $2,000. I took a gamble purchasing it, but no matter the condition, I'd have fun trying to service it, and by extension, making content about it. And that's what this is. Alright, so this came across the country by freight shipping, and the box does look like it's been handled properly. Just a word of caution when buying a tube television or a PVM on eBay. I've heard tons of horror stories. It's like a 50-50 shot. It'll actually reach you in one piece. Buying local is definitely preferred, but sometimes it's not always available. It's best to make sure the seller knows how to ship the thing, and even then you never know what you're going to get. In my case, the seller seemed to know what they were doing with the freight shipping provider they used, and they didn't give the PVM to Ace Ventura, let's just say. Alright, the moment of truth. Lots of foam padding here. Many of these egg crate looking padding squares. Save money buying soundproofing squares for your walls from Amazon and just buy an expensive CRT off eBay. You'll have more than enough to cover your podcasting room. The PVM was very snugly packed in there, so I turned the box to the side and cut another wall of the box off so I could remove it easier. There we go. And in addition to the protection of those podcast foam squares, you have a nice layer of bubble wrap. Removed that bubble wrap and inspected the condition of the PVM. And yeah, it looks like there was no obvious damage sustained during shipping. But maybe the damage is internal. So how about I plug in a console and turn it on? I hooked up my S-Video modded Sega Genesis just as a quick test to see if we have a lemon here. I heard the deep groan of it powering on, and there's static on the screen. That's a good sign. Now I need to fiddle with the inputs in the front, pressing random buttons like an ape until I accidentally select S-Video. Oh, there's something. But obviously not quite right. Alright, there's underscan mode. Oh, here we go. And then turned underscan mode off. And there we go. Alright. Obviously, it needs some screen calibration, but this already looks amazing. Beautiful color, nice chunky scan lines, sharp as all hell. I feared this thing would be in bad shape, but it's in way better condition than I imagined. One thing I noticed after bringing it in is there's a bunch of gunk on the screen. Again, I was afraid this was hiding a big scrape or a scratch on the screen, so I sprayed some glass cleaner on there and gave the screen a good wipe with a cloth. And not only did the gunk come right off, the screen is immaculate. Not a scratch on it. Best case scenario. Made sure there's no streaks or residue on there. And I'm really happy I didn't have to try to remove an anti-glare protective layer or something because there were so many gashes or scratches on it. One thing I didn't quite realize when I first turned it on because I was fiddling with the buttons and dials a bit, when you first start up the PVM, the corners here kind of droop and sag. You sort of see it here. You can really tell in the Zelda Select screen. See? See those droopy corners? And as the monitor warms up, the corners start to shift into place. Not only that, when you put it into underscan mode, the sides of the image are kind of bowed in. What that tells me is that there's failing or out-of-spec capacitors in the circuit that control the geometry. And as those capacitors heat up, they begin to get more in spec, so the image improves the longer the monitor is on. So what that means, we should replace those capacitors before the problem gets any worse. I decided to order the capacitor kit that Savon Pat sells on eBay. This is a targeted capacitor kit that really only replaces a fraction of the capacitors in the PVM that commonly cause problems. And now I'll install this kit to see if it alleviates the CRT's problems. Kind of like how a bottle of whiskey solves all of my problems. Inside the packet Savon Pat sent me was, of course, his business card. There's a checklist detailing all the capacitors we will be removing and replacing. And here's the capacitors, which look to be largely Rubicon capacitors, which is a reputable brand. Alright, now it's time to remove this cover. I'm doing this work in my basement, so you may see many old baby things in the background. Just ignore those. I try to ignore them so that I don't weep at the passage of time. Where's that bottle of whiskey? Anyway, I removed the 2 screws from each of the bottom corners. I removed the 2 screws near the inputs in the back, went over to the SDI input area, and those screws are missing. Who knows when and where they went missing? Then I removed the 3 screws on each side. First the 2 on the bottom, and then the 1 on the top. One note about screws, I like to keep them in labeled cups. That way if I take a break or have to reassemble later, I can easily remember specifically where each of the unique screw groups go. Make sure you have a lot of room behind you as you back up and slide off the cover, just moving it straight back until it's clear. Looking inside, and it's surprisingly clean. Maybe just a light coating of dust, but nothing crazy. All the pieces look to be in the right spot, so nothing got jostled in transport. Here's my exact version of the monitor, and it was manufactured in January of 2000, so almost 24 years ago. Facing the back of the monitor, hanging off the left side, you have the power supply. On the right side, you have the SDI card, which I believe is an optional card and may not be there for yours. The board I need to work on is on the bottom here, the A board. So I'll need to do some work to get access to it. Which means, next, I'll remove the power supply by removing the 2 screws up front. Then, you lift the board up to remove it, and once free, lay it down on the side. Then I went around the board, first removing all the connections from this corner and all the wire bundles on the sides. I loosened the ground wire here, making sure to save the screw. And I removed the wire connections from the other 2 corners as well. Finally, threading this ribbon cable out of these tabs and removing the power supply. Next, I took the 2 screws off the front of the SDI card, and in a similar way to the power supply, I lifted it up, setting it to the side. Then I removed the 2 connections on the bottom, and with the SDI card removed, I removed this connection from the top of the yoke here. Now here's your obligatory warning. Working inside a CRT is dangerous. They can hold enough charge to stop your heart, so take caution, consult your doctor, confess to your priest, make sure your will is updated, kiss your dog, and take a dump. Okay? Got it? Good. Here's how Sony's techs were taught how to discharge an anode cap. What I did was firmly grasp the anode cap and pinch the connector and pull until it comes free. You can see the connection inside the cup that needed to be pinched. Then I tapped the connection on the metal chassis. Next, I tapped the connection on the tube with a good quality screwdriver, which was connected to the outer metal casing as well. You'll see I'm wearing nitrile gloves. Don't be confused. These are useless. I'm wearing these for unrelated cleaning. There are gloves you can buy that protect you from shocks, or at least better protect you, but I didn't bother. I like to live dangerously. Now that the tube is discharged, I'll dig deeper into the CRT. I remove this screw to the grounding plate. Before realizing that I did it in the wrong order, I had to remove this middle wire here, and it's harder to do now because I removed the first one first, and this one I have to hold and take off. It's harder. It's harder now. I did this. I disconnected this on the neck board. I tried to remove this connection that's also on the neck board, but it wouldn't budge easily, so I just removed it from the other side on the A board. Going over to the flyback, I removed this black wire that pops off after some force, then this red one which pops off in the same way. On the other side of the neck board, I removed this black wire which is removed with a metal switch on the connector. With that, I gently slid the board back a bit so I can get to the connectors near the front of the board. Looking at the left side facing the back, I disconnected these wires. The good thing about these connectors is that they're color-coded, and generally the connectors are unique enough you shouldn't be confused when you put this all back together. On the right side, I disconnected this wire, and deeper in there's a few to disconnect as well. With all those disconnected, the board should be free. And like I said before, make sure there's plenty of room behind you so you can easily slide it straight out. Watch out for any wires that decide to get tangled along the way. Now I can just lift this out and bring it to my workstation and finish the rest. There's 4 screws to remove, one on the right, one on the left, one in front of the flyback, and one in the center. Remove the I/O board by disconnecting these cables on the side, these in the back, and then lift the tabs on the side of the I/O board assembly. And I forgot to remove one last of these black wires here that you need to pull off. With that, the I/O board assembly can be put aside. And this black plastic frame on the A board can be removed. Phew! Finally, we have the board we need to work with. Now we need to locate the capacitors we need to remove and replace, and to do this I used a combination of the service manual, which I will link in the description below, and I used my eyes, as they are clearly marked on the board itself. And what I did was I used the list, and as I went along I marked the capacitors I needed to remove with blue painter's tape on top. Marked them for slaughter, so to speak. On my version of this board, you can see the capacitors mostly in this region here. You can see many of them near heat sinks on transistors, so no wonder these fail so often. It's a high heat area. The next cluster is in between these heat sinks on the flyback. Again, it looks like a high heat area. And finally, there's one lone capacitor behind the flyback. The reason I marked them beforehand is so I don't have to hunt for each of them as I remove them. I can just assembly line remove and replace without having to pause the hunt. And I'm not going to film every single capacitor that I remove. I'll just demonstrate with the first one, which will be literally the first one on the list. This guy right up front. On the list, it's C522. For my birthday this year, I finally got a desoldering gun. Before I had to use either copper braid or this Radio Shack one with a manual bulb. This guy should make quick work of this. I stood the board up so I can have access to underneath the capacitor on the other side of the board. I like to add fresh solder to the joints, heating it up with a soldering iron, and adding the solder. Freshening up the solder will make it easier to remove. Then I touch the solder with a heating gun, heating it up just until it liquefies, and pulled the trigger to vacuum it. And then I did the same thing to the other side. My heat setting on this gun is set to just under the number 2 setting, FYI. Then I take my finger, place it on the capacitor on the other side of the board, and wiggle it to make sure the leads are free of the board. A lot of times I'll do this while I desolder, which can help free the leads from stray solder as it cools. I grabbed the capacitor and wiggled it out of the board. And there we go. I confirm the value of the capacitor with a value on the list on the kit, and I like to make a dash mark on the list showing I removed the capacitor. It's always good to take notes as you move along so you don't lose track or get confused. Here's the replacement capacitor, which I confirmed has the same value as the one I removed. And there's the space where it will go. Pay attention to the polarity as marked on the board. So I slid the capacitor in there. The negative side usually has a shorter lead and it's marked with a shaded bar. Then on the other side, I bent the leads to hold it into place. I applied some solder with the soldering iron and snipped off the excess leads. And there we go. A brand new capacitor is in place, which I will check off the list, confirming that yes, I did replace that one. Then it's just a matter of going down the list and removing all the marked capacitors. Here's a satisfying pile of old capacitors. And here's all the new capacitors in place. You have the group up front, these ones in the middle, and of course our lonely friend in the back. Don't worry, C592. I didn't forget about you. Then I reassembled the PVM. And luckily, I was making this video, so I filmed the whole thing, so everything is exactly where it was when I took it apart. Definitely not one piece is out of place. Not one screw is missing, and every wire is bundled where it was before. It's all back there, to where it was, perfectly. Seriously though, I advise you to take pictures at least as you go along. It'll help you remember where things went, especially if it becomes a multi-day job. It was for me because I have little children and I only have pockets of time to work on this. Having photos and videos to reference is a huge plus on reassembly. With it all put back together, now is as good a time as any to look at the inputs here. In addition to the SDI card, you see that I have a couple of composite inputs, an S-video input, component and RGB with external sync, and each of those have outputs, which is handy. Today I'll be using this SCART to BNC converter to hook up my Super Nintendo through RGB SCART. Now the moment of truth. Did I fix it? Or, by tinkering with it, did I do more damage to this perfectly fine PVM? And, hallelujah, it works on the first try. I loaded up Artemio's 240p test suite just so I can do some quick calibrations. I threw up a grid and I accessed the service menu by pushing the menu button and then degauss and enter at the same time. And I kind of just fiddled with the settings until it looked good enough to my eye. I don't think I'm knowledgeable enough to go over what each setting exactly does, and it's sort of out of the scope of this video, but Retro Tech has a few good videos on geometry calibration, so I highly recommend checking out his channel for specific knowledge on PVM calibration. Once I was happy with the geometry, I wanted to check these color bars, and man, not sure if this is coming out on camera, but I think this tube is in pretty good condition, at least from what I can tell. And now this thing looks absolutely gorgeous. No more drooping corners. In underscan mode, it doesn't bow in anymore. Great colors. I don't think I've ever seen retro games look this good. You have those fun, chunky scan lines. You get that organic looking image that you can't stop looking at. And lastly, the PVM is missing the Sony badge, and that's really been bothering me. Honestly, it makes games impossibly distracting when it's not there. So I went to this website called vath.co and I ordered a new badge. It's a sticker really, but what's great about it is it's 3D and metallic, so it looks similar to the real thing. Just peeled off the back and placed it over the discolored space where the old badge used to be. And there! Now that's a proper PVM. I was ready to throw it into the trash. And yes, I confirmed with the badge on there, it makes the games look better. It's true. And take a look. Zero even swings his sword, his little laser sword, better knowing the branding is there. That was probably the most fun I had on one of these soldering projects. Definitely was worth the effort, and the reward was oh so great. And it looks great sitting on my desk as I work. See, it's been behind me this whole time. That's the magic of editing. I hope you learned something, and if you have any questions or any other remarks, leave them in the comments below. Well, that's all I got for now. Until next time, bye.